Well, so yesterday we learned how the Chazal wanted to make sure that everywhere in the entire Azara was a place that was qualified to do shchita in for Kaddish and Kalam, as well as Achilas Kachem, and because of that, they made, and being that it has to be El Pesach or El Moed, they made sure that there was enough doors in the Heichel building so that wherever you would be in the Azara, whether it would be to the east of the Beis HaMikdash, to the west of the Beis HaMikdash, to the north or south, you would always be in direct eyesight and direct line of sight of a door, and that's how they were sure that anywhere in the Azara was eligible to eat kachim as well as to shech Kaddish Kalam, and they had a sentry by each one of those doors. They had a sentry on the outside, I guess an honor guard by each doorway, as we learned from Divrei Hayam, which takes us to the bottom, second to the bottom line on Daf Nun Hayam base. Well, thank you so much. Oh, you can use that for Zok the Heilige Gemara. Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Omar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Ein chayovin mishum tuma. You're not chayiv for walking into the Azara when you're tamei, only for a very specifically demarcated area. Ella al oirech mea ushmoinim v'sheva. The Azara, its dimensions are 187 amos long. Al roichav mea ushloshim v'chamesh, by 135 amos. That's how big the area of the Azara was, legabe the iser of going into it when one is tamei. And if we just peek at Rashi ein chayovim mishum tuma, hanichnas tamei laharabayis. If one walks in when he's tamei into harabayis, he will not be chayiv mishum tuma. Elam kein nichnas latoich hekev chalal ha'azara, unless he's in the perimeter of the Azara. Who haya? How long was it? Oirech kuf pei zayin al roichev kuf lamed hey kidetnan b'meseches midos. Like we learned in Meseches Midos, lemute anichnas lelishkois habenuyos chutzala ufosuchos lesoichai. There's a lot of little rooms, chambers that you would access through the inside of the Azara. Physically, they were outside the perimeter of the Azara, but the access to them was through the Azara. Those areas, Shaloi Niskachu B'Kedushas HaAzara, they were not Niskavish with Kedushas HaAzara. How were they Makdish HaAzara? There was actually a ceremony in which they made Kedusha of the Azara, and they used a carbon mincha, B'Shir mincha, with the shir of mincha, Ubishir Shel Pagoyim, which is a certain set of shir amalises, it's a certain set of Kevedat Hilim, Ubur Batumim, Shemekachin Bas Azara, there Ubahalicha Saviv, and walking around the perimeter. There's a whole process that's outlined in the Gemara Shvuos as to how they were Mekadesh to Azara. Okay, Gavaltik. Zok the Gemara, Tani Tana Kamed Rab Nachman. A brisa was quoted in front of Rab Nachman. Kol Azara, Hoysa Kuf Pei Zayin, 187, Al Roichev Kuf Lamerei by 135. Amar Lei, Hacha Amar Li Abba. This is what my father told me. Kagoyin Zeh, in this area, Kaihanim Nichnosim Lasham, Ve'oichlin Sham Kochet Kochem, Ve'shoichtin Sham Kochem Kalim, Ve'chayovin Mishum Toma. So he's telling us this is the Azara, and there's three halachas related to the Azara. A is you can eat kachem kachem within that perimeter. B is you can shech kaddish and kalam anywhere in the Azara. And C, if one walks into that Azara when he's tamei, he will be chayiv. Lumute mai. So what wouldn't be a problem? Which areas would not be considered a problem, which would not be qualified for the shechita and the chilas kachem? If you're telling me there were windows and doorways in the wall of the Azara, in that hallway space or window space, it was a very thick wall, right? It could have been a couple of amas wide or thick. So in that area or on top of the wall, again, it was a thick wall. In those areas, you were not able to shecht, you would not be able to eat kachim, and if you walked on those areas when one is tamei, one would not be over. Tanina, we learned. So if you're going to tell me that's the chiddush, that can't be the chiddush because we have a meforsha mishnah. Hachaloynois v'oivei kilifnim. We actually have a meforsha mishnah that says pum fakeret, that those are actually considered as part of the kedushas harazara. So we can't be excluding that area from the kedushas harazara. Ela lemute lishkais. It must be excluding the chambers that open up to the Azara. As Rashi said earlier, their access to them is only through the Azara, but physically they're built outside the perimeter of the Azara. If you're going to tell me that we're speaking about Lishkais, where the only access to them are through the Azara, but they're physically in the Choyel, but now we learn Toichen Kodesh. They have a status of Kodesh, and therefore you'll be Chayiv Mishum Tumah. So once again, it's not consistent with what you're saying. Zok Gemara that it says Toichen Kodesh Lagabe Tumah is only Midirabanan. It's Midirabanan. They said a Tumah shouldn't go in there, but Lamais, if a Tumah went in there, he wouldn't have to bring the Karbanis if he went in B'Shogeg. He wouldn't have the Chiyuv Kars if he went in. It's only Midirabanan. Frag the Gemara. So you tell me Midiraisa, the Lishkais are not considered part of the Azara, and therefore if someone went into them b'tumasai, he would not be chayiv Midiraisa. Is that so? But Tanya we learned Lishkais b'nuyos b'choil ufsuchais lahektish, exactly the chambers that we're referring to. Minayin shakayhanim nichnasin l'sham. How do we know that Kohanim are allowed to go into those lishkais? How do we know they can eat kachim in those lishkais? In other words, how do we know that they are considered part and parcel of the Azara? And from that pasuk we learn that Torah ripsa chatzeros harbe etel achilach. The Torah was marbe many chatzeros to eat kachim. Now, exactly what the limud is not thoroughly clear. There's actually a machloikis rishonim, but let's just first get the gears of the shita. Hatay ripsa harbe leachila. He takes out the word achas. Rashi explains the limud as follows. Vatanya minayin lishkais with Rabbeinu Lula in Yinachila shema mina kedushas hein mina Torah. Right, since we say you can eat there, kachim, that must be mina Torah. The Rabbanan can't allow you to eat out of the Azara. The Rabbanan can't consider a certain area part of the Azara if you're actually not allowed to eat kachim there. The Rabbanan across machtahu hey chakila Rabbanan lakir dover ulahachur mokim choy lachilas kachim. So here is where Rashi explains the limud. V'lo yishin sheitin sham kachim kalam hachal. Where does Rashi touch this? I saw Rashi spoke briefly about how this works. 1 second. So Rashi learns, we learn it from Chatzar Moed, which means Rashi will learn that the word Chatzar Oil Moed is extra. So let's have a look in the pasuk. Rashi learns that's all it had to say. We know Makom Kodesh. Azara. Why does the pasuk stick in the extra words Chatzar Oil Moed to tell us that there are other areas that you would have thought would not be considered royal achila, such as those lishkais. The Torah by saying b'chatzar almod yochlua is being marba those little lishkais. Now at this point, the Gemara assumes that it's either kodesh or it's not kodesh. So if it's kodesh and you can eat kachim there, then you'll be chayiv if you go in there with your tummy. They're one and the same. Zok to Gemara Amarava, no, they're not one and the same. The Azara could be kodesh lagabe certain halachas, but not lagabe other halachas. Amarava lachila shiny. It only has kedushas Azara lagabe being able to eat kachim in there because of the special pasuk of Bachatzar Oil Moed. But Lemaisa, it's not considered part of the Azara, and therefore someone who's in there b'tumasoi would not be chayiv. But you're going to tell me that the Inyan Tuma, it's not considered part of the Azara in those lishkois? V'atanya, we learned the brisa. Lishkois habenuis b'choil. Uvesuchais l'kodesh, kayhanim nichnasen l'sham, v'oichlin sham kachem kachem, v'ein shoichtim sham kadeshim kalim. You can't check kadeshim kalim. So you see that it's not considered an Azara, l'gabe shchitis kadeshim kalim, and v'chayovim mishum tuma, but it is chayiv mishum tuma. So you see clearly that those lishkois are considered part and parcel of the Azara, l'gabe tuma. So now this is a little bit confusing here because we have l'gabe achilus kachim is part of the Azara, l'gabe tuma is part of the Azara, but l'gabe shechtin kadeshim kalim is not part of the Azara. Zog to Gemara, lav omrit ein sheichtin. By sheichtin, you said ein sheichtin. So you said it's not considered. This brisa says that these areas are not considered part of the Azara. L'gabe shchitus kadeshim kalim. You know what? Let's amend the brisa and don't say v'chayovim mishum tuma. Taninami ein chayovim. So ein sheichtin. So you could eat kachim there, but you can't shech kadeshim kalim because it's not the Azara, and you cannot, and you're not chayiv mishum tuma. The only thing is, it's a special pasuk to tell you that you're allowed to eat kachim there, you're allowed to eat kachim there, but it's technically not part of the Azara, not for shita, not for tum. Zok to Gemara. So you want to amend and say that the brisa doesn't say chayav mishum tuma, the brisa says ein chayav. That's what you want to say, which means that tzai ein sheichtin and tzai ein chayav. Well, frankly, Gemara, there's a big difference between tuma and shchita. Bishlam ein sheichtin. I understand why the brisa would say ein sheichtin, because even though it might be considered part of the Azara, but ina keneged Pesach veleka. The halacha is that we learned it yesterday that the shechita is only allowed where you could see the Pesach oil moed. If you're in one of those lishkos, you can't see the Pesach oil moed. You're in a chamber off to the side. So it makes sense why the Mishnah would have said ein sheichtim. Ella. So even if you consider it part of the Azara, there's a technical problem that you're not within a line of sight of the Pesach oil moed. Ella ain't chayovin, but to say that you're not chayiv mishum tuma, am I? Why in the world shouldn't you be mechuyev mishum tuma? If it has kedushas ha'azara, how could you logically explain why you won't be chayiv mishum tuma? And therefore, I reject what you're saying, and I tell you, and I claim that the Brayos says chayav mishum tuma. So it's tzarich shver because now we're saying that those lishkas have a full status of the azara. And according to you, who you want to say it says chayovin when it says about Tumah. But ain't sheichtin. What do you mean ain't sheichtin? You cannot shechten those lishkos. Milo yaskinon the ika shchita keneged a Pesach. It must be that even if you're in the lishka and you're still within the line of sight of a Pesach Mishkan, even there the Bryce is telling you ain't sheichtin. Because if the Bryce is speaking when you're not in the line of sight, then it has nothing to do with the fact that it's a lishka. It's a separate halacha. The ileka l'mayitzrich. Why do I need a brayso to tell me that in the lishka, if you're not within the line of sight, you can't check there? Wherever you are, if you're not in the line of sight, you can't check. So it must be that the brayso telling you a chiddush that even if you're in the line of sight, you can't check from the lishka. Why? Because it's not really the kedushas azara. The brayso must be telling you that you cannot check in the lishka even if you were in the direct line of sight of the door of the heichal. Why? Because that zone, that area, that land, that property is not eligible for shchitas kachim. Mishum de lakadosh. So once the brayso says that chiddush that it doesn't have kedushas azara l'gabe shchita, tani nami ain't chayovin. So too, I can say ain't chayovin. You're not chayav mishum tumah. Why? Because it doesn't really have kedushas azara. You're allowed to eat kachim there. That's because there's a gzeres hakosov that tells you b'chatzar oil moed yechlu. Zok Gemara ulachila. So you're telling me there's only restriction of Keneged Pesach is for the Shechita. But for the Achila, you don't need it because in the same scenario, you're allowed to eat anywhere in the Lishka. If you get anywhere in the Lishka, you're not necessarily going to be within the line of sight of the Pesach. Practically more about Tanya we learned, Rabbi Yosy Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, Shnei Pishpashin Hayu Bevesach Halifos. We learned this yesterday, right? There were two little doorways. A little doorway means 8 amas high, right? It's a little doorway. It's only 8 amas high, right? Goyvin Shmoina, they were 8 Amasai, Kedei lahachsher eso Azara lachilas kachim kachim, ulashchitas kachim kalim. So you see clearly that the status of where you're allowed to eat kachim kachim is the same status as to where you can shecht. And clearly the Bryce is saying that in order to shecht kachim kalim, and in order to be able to eat kachim kachim, you have to be within line of sight of the door, and that's why they made this extra door. So it's not just for shchitas kachim kalim; it's also for achilas kachim kachim. That's what the Brisa says. So clearly, the Brisa seems to indicate that if you're not within line of sight of a Pesach HaMishkan, you are not able to eat kachim kachim. Ravina sami mikan achila. The Brisa that says that they had 2 doorways to be makshir eso azara lachilas kachim kachim, take that out. All it should say is they had to pishpashim lahachshir azara l'shchitas kachim kalim, but it has no impact on the achilas kachim kachim because they could be eaten anywhere in the azara, even in the lishkos, even if it's not within line of sight of the Pesach oil moed. Frank, how can you say that? Vaksiv, this is referring to the Miluyim. It says Bishlu Sabosor Pesach oil moed v'sham toichlu oisai. You see clearly, you should cook the basar Pesach oil moed, and there you should eat it. So you see, you have to eat it Pesach oil moed. So you see, there is a requirement of Pesach oil moed. So how could you tell me take it away from the brisa? You see, you do need Pesach oil moed. So after Gemara, you needed it for that specific carbon. Kachay shah shani, that specific carbon required on the chilo where you're within line of sight to the Pesach oil moed. But ledoires, all the karbonis, you can eat kachay kachim even if you're not in direct line of sight of the Pesach oil moed, and you can eat it even in those lishkos, although those lishkos do not have a din of the Azara, lagabe shchitas kadishim kalim, and they don't have a din of the Azara, lagabe entering it when one is top. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Omer B'yitach bar Avudimai, minayin ledam shenifsal b'shkiyas hachama. Tosfos asks, why didn't the Gemara say minayin ledam shenifsal b'lina? How do you know that once shkia arrives, the dam is possible? So Rashi learns it's merely a discussion of lina. So why does it say shkia sakama? Lina is the next morning. Tosfos learns that it becomes possible at night, even before nightfall, even by the earlier shkia. Because according to Rabbeinu Tam, there's the early shkia, beginning of shkia, and the end of shkia. So it's talking about that, not the long Tosfos. Anyway, how do we know dam doesn't have this psul? Shenemar b'yom hakrivoi. How do we know it does have the psul? How do you know dam does become possible? You know, because it says b'yom hakrivoi esivchoi yeyachel. So we learned that hakrava, which is the dam, and the zevach is the meat, have to be eaten, have to be consumed at the same time. B'yom shato zeveach, the day that you shecht, ata makriv, that's the day you have to make the zrikas adam. B'yom shi'ata zeveach, on the day that you can't shecht, yata makriv. Let's have a look at Rashi. B'yom shato zeveach ata makriv, b'yom shi'ata zeveach yata makriv. Hachi gersin lo b'chulu sugya. This is how we're goers, this is the entire sugya. And kachmat tasimuka, this is how I saw it quoted. V'achi barusha. The akrava sadam and the zvicha have to occur on the same day. So this is the point that Rashi makes over here. What if I put the dam on the mizbeach? The halacha is once a varim are on the mizbeach, they do not become possible. So let's say you put a varim on the mizbeach tonight, and they're still burning, and they're still there the next morning, they're not possible. You leave them on there, they burn. So does this halacha apply to the dam as well? Leave the dam on the mizbeach and then spritz it the next day. But it wouldn't be possible. Zokt Rashi, we learn from B'yoim, Shatozavech and the Makriv, only the day of the Shechita is the day that you could do the Shrika, and even if the dam is left on the mizbeach overnight, which normally protects meat from lina, it does not protect the dam, and therefore the carbon will be possible if the dam is left even on the mizbeach overnight. Gewalt. Zok to Gemara, how could you learn some extra limit out of this pasuk? You need this pasuk for its pasuk to pshat. Haimi boyele legufe. We need this pasuk to teach us pasuk pshat. That what? Zok to Gemara, legufe means lelamed zman achilas shlamim b'yom zevichas and b'machras. The pasuk is telling you the time that you're allowed to eat a carbon shlamim. Today, the day of the Shechita, and the next day. So there's no extra words in this pasuk from where you can learn this halacha that's referring to the dam. Zok to Gemara, Im Kain, if all it was telling us was the amount of time that you're allowed to korban shlomim, Neimer Kra, B'yom Zivcha Yeyachel. All the pasuk should have said B'yom Zivcha Yeyachel. But that's not what the pasuk says. What the pasuk says, looking at the pasuk inside, what the pasuk says is V'mneder Nidava Zevach Karbonei B'yom Akrivoy Ezivcha Yeyachel. According to B'yom Zivcha Yeyachel Umimachros, the shlomim is eaten on the day of the Zevach and the next day. What do you mean B'yom Akrivoy Ezivcha? B'yom Akrivoy Ezivcha is redundant language to teach us that it's referring to the dam as well. Im Kei name of B'yom Zivcha Yeyachel B'yom Akrivoy Ezivcha Lamali Shema Mino B'yom Shato Zevach Atamakriv B'yom Shiato Zevach Atamakriv. Zok Gemara, no. The reason why it says B'yom Akrivoy is maybe the Torah told me a different chiddush, and that is Ikariv dam ha'idna. If you make zrika of the dam today on day one of the shchita, nisachel basar ha'idna u'lamachar, then you'll be able to eat the basar today and tomorrow. But ikariv dam l'machar, if you only spritz the blood and matu the basar l'achila tomorrow, so then the clock starts to tick tomorrow. Nisachel basar l'machar u'layema uchra. And that's why it says, He's just telling you, when does the clock start to tick as far as the timing of your Chilas Shlomim? It starts with the Zrika. And that's why maybe it says, but how do you know that you cannot spritz the dam on day two, only on day one? Zok Gemara, because there's still an extra word. Imkei name akra, b'yom akrivo yeyachel zifchai. No, b'yom akrivo yeyachel. B'yom akrivo yeyachel. The day you're makriv you eat. And then we'll know that you have to do it on that day. Zivchoy lamali. Why does it say zivchoy? There it is. Shemami no b'yom shata sheveach atam akrivoy b'yom shiata sheveach yatam akrivoy. Gewaltig. 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 Sagt er mal weiter. Itmar. Hamachashev la'or shlishi. What if someone has a machshava of pigel of chutz l'zmanai? And what was his machshava? While he was shechting it, he had kavana that he was going to eat it not the third day, but tonight after day two. So we know you could only eat the korban shlamim for 2 days. So after the second day in the evening, you're no longer allowed to eat the korban shlamim. What if the machshava of pigel was to eat it on that third night? Rashi tells us, b'shchita shlomim, you had kavana by the shchita shlomim machshava of pigel, amunas lechal min habasar la'or shlishi, which is leil sheni l'zvicha, the night after the night of the zvicha. Chizki Amar Kosher. Chizki said it's not possible. It's not possible chutz manai. Mind-boggling. You're not allowed to eat it anymore. Yet that's not called pigel of chutz manai. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Pasal. What do you mean that's pigel? You have in mind to eat the carbon when you're no longer allowed to eat it. So what is the explanation of it? Chizki Amar Kosher. The Hala intik l'shreifa. Yeah, sure, I agree that the Zman Achila has ended. But there's no din shreifas noiser because it always says the halacha of noiser is it doesn't become noiser till it's left overnight, and then overnight it becomes noiser, and then by daybreak you put it on, you burn it. So the point is, hilchach noiser. It's not noiser until the next morning. So the question is, when you have a machshava to eat something chutz manoi, is it merely the fact that you're no longer allowed to eat it anymore, like Rabbi Yochanan holds, or Chizkiyahu? No, you have to have a machshava to eat noiser. You have a machshava to eat noiser, that would be considered pigel. And even though you can no longer eat it after the second day, since it doesn't become noiser until the next morning, only if you had in mind to eat it the next morning would it be pigel. You're no longer allowed to eat it. I don't care if it's technically considered noiser or not, but since you're no longer allowed to eat it, you had kavanah when you shechted it to eat it. When you
call it at night,
sorry,
before it becomes noiser.
It's also to eat, but it's not noiser. It's meat. Why does it have to have a name for it?
Everything else has a name.
I hear. So that is a shaila. So again, we're exposed to a brand new concept. To us, it's always cut and dry. Pigel chutz mani means if you had a mind to eat it when you weren't allowed to eat it. Now the Gemara is telling us that not all prohibitions to eat meat are created equal, because just because you can't eat it, maybe that wouldn't be chutz manoi zogt chizkiya because it's not noisher yet. What about ha'oichel or shlishi? What if it's not a case of pigel? Someone actually ate the carbon shlomim after the second day in the evening. It's not noisher yet. Chizkiya or potter, you're potter. You're not chayiv kars. You don't bring a carbon for eating noisar. You know why? It's not yet noisar. Rabbi Yochanan or chayiv. You'll be chayiv. Why? You're chayiv. I'm not sure what you're chayiv for, but you're chayiv because it's itche me'achila. It seems like you're chayiv from noisar. In other words, it becomes noisar right away. You're not allowed to eat it. The zman shreifa isn't until the next morning, but it becomes noisar right away. So it sounds like there's almost a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiya. When does something become noisar? Does it become noisar the moment you're not allowed to eat anymore? And the shaila is merely when the chiyuv to burn noisar is, not by night, by day. Or maybe it doesn't become noisar until the chiyuv shreifa arrives. And that's the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiya, and therefore would have two nafkaminas. A, if you ate the meat after the second day, is that called eating noisar? And B, if you had kavanah to eat the meat on the second night, is that called pigel? Tanya Kava said, Rabbi Yochanan, we have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan's shita, that in fact it's noisar as soon as nightfall comes, and if you had kavanah to eat shlomim after the second day in the evening, it would be chayiv, it would be pigel. And it says as follows: if you have kochim that are only eaten for one day, like a carbon toida or a carbon katos, mechashvin bidomon mishatishka achama. If you had kavanah to make this rika chutz manoi, zok Rashi, shachat almanas lizrek doma mishatishka achama. That's pigel, because you're only allowed to make this rika sadam during the first day that the carbon is brought. If you had kavanah to do this rika sadam in the evening, so that's pigel. That's a chutz manoi. That's when you're having kavanah about spritzing the dam. So mechashvim bedomon mishatishka achama. But what about ube besarin ube emurein? What if you had kavanah to eat the meat chutz lizmanoi, or to be makter the emurim on the mizbech chutz lizmanoi? There, if you had kavanah to do it in the evening, it would not be pigel. But mishayala amura shachar, if you had kavanah to be makter the emurim when they're noisar next day, or the basar in the morning when you're no longer allowed to eat it and it becomes noisar, that's going to be pigel. So let's see Rashi again. Continuing Rashi. If while you were shechting, you had in mind almanas lechol mi besaran, to eat from the meat of the carbon, that's pigel. That's chutz. Now, what about shlomim? What about them? The dam is the same thing. It doesn't matter what the rules of eating the carbon. All carbonos, the dam have to be spritzed that day before shkia, and therefore, if you had kavanah to spritz the blood after shkia, that's pigel of chutz lizman. But by the emurin, when do you have to be makter emurin of all carbonos, even a shlomim? Again, by the next morning. So uve'emureyan mishayala amar shachar. By emureyan, you have a whole night until Amar Shachar, because that's when you can no longer be Makter Emurin. So where did it become Chutz Manoi? The next morning. But Uva Besaran, where you're allowed to eat the basar of the Shlomim even on the second day, Mishatishka Hachama Shol Shnei Yomim, by Shkia the next day. So this is Meforsh like Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said if you had Kavanah to eat the meat the second evening, that's going to be pigel. Chizkiya said it's kosher. But clearly from this brisa, you see that it's pigel, so you have a raya to Rabbi Yochanan that it's possible against Rabbi Chizkiya, who holds it's kosher. Zok the brisa weiter. Tanu Rabbanan. Yochel Yehu necholin la'or shlishi. I would have thought that you can eat a carbon shlomim even the third evening. You can eat it even the third evening after the second day. Vidinu, and there's a logical argument to be made to support that shita. because Zevachim necholin liyoy mechad, uzevachim necholin l'shnayam. There are certain karbanos that you could only eat for one day, but then there's the shlomim that could be eaten for 2 days, and we should compare the two. Just like karbanos that could only be eaten for one day, the night follows the day, and therefore you can eat them until daybreak of the next morning. So too, the next night you should also be able to eat them. As Rashi says, "Laila charein dechsiv b'toida." Says about a carbon toida, "Lo yaniach mimenu ad boiker." You can eat it the whole night. Af kal b'shlomim, maybe say the same thing. Tei laila achar yoyim amoch. Zok to Gemara, Talmud Loimer, v'anoiser ad yoyim. Says anoiser ad yoyim. Rashi says gabei achila. When the Torah is discussing when you're allowed to eat the carbon, ksiv b'kadoshim to you. It says in Parshas Kadoshim, b'yoyim zivchachem yoyachel. You can eat a carbon on the day of the carbon, umi machros, and the next day, which is referring to the shlomim, the hanoiser ad yoyim. So since it's hanoiser ad yoyim, you're allowed to eat it as long as there is still day up until the evening of the second day. So that's how we're darshaning the pasuk. So it says, "B'yom zevchachem yoyachel umi machros v'hanoiser ad yoyim hashlishi beishes reifu." So we learn ad yoyim means until there is light outside. On day 2, you're allowed to eat it. You can't eat it after that. Okay? Zok to Gemara, but yoyim unechal ve'ein unechal la'or shlishi. You can't eat it on the evening preceding day 3. Yochel yisarf miyad. So you might think the moment the evening comes after the second day, now it's noiser. Now you need to burn it right away. Vidinu. Again, there's a logical argument to be made that you have to burn the shlomim as soon as the end of day 2 comes. Because Zevachim necholin liyoyim echad, uzvachim necholin l'shnayomim. Mazvachim necholin liyoyim echad. Take of lachila shreifa, the moment they become prohibited to be eaten, which is sunrise of the next morning, right then gets triggered the chiyuv to burn them as noiser. So maybe avzvachim necholin l'shnayomim. Take of lachila shreifa. Maybe as well, the moment there's manachila expires, there's a chiyuv to burn them. Talmud Loimer, when it talks about burning the noiser, it says bayoyim hashlishi va'eshi sarei. So that's a different pasuk. It says va'noiser mi besara zevach bayoyim hashlishi, not ad yoyim, bayoyim. Bayoyim says when do you burn it? You burn it on day 3, not in the evening. Bayoyim ata soifor v'at soifor balayla. So by achila, it says ad yoyim, until the end of the day. By shreiv, it says bayoyim, meaning you can only burn it by day, even though it had already been prohibited to be eaten from the night before. Beautiful. On to the next Mishnah. Habechor v'hamaiser v'apesach. Bechor is a firstborn animal. Meiser is meiser behema, and the carbon pesach. Kodoshim kalim. They're all kodoshim kalim, and therefore shechitason bechol mochem ba'azara. They can be shechted anywhere in the Azara. The damon toun matana achas. They only need one matana of dam, but you can't spritz it anywhere on the mizbeach. It has to be only on an area of the mizbeach. Ubilvat sheyitin keneged hayisod. So we already learned where is there a yisod. We learned that the whole northern, the whole western side, the whole western side has a yisod. The entire northern side has a yisod. There's one amma of yisod on the east side, and there's one amma of yisod on the south side. So that is where the one matana of dam for these 3 karbanos can be offered. However, shina b'achilos, even though they're similar karbanos in their akrava, their eating are very different one from the other. First of all, habachar nechal l'kayhanim. The bachar, if it's a bachar tam, no matter what, the bachar is eaten by kayhanim. The kohen gets the bachar. It says, Rashi says, uvisar miyalach. The Torah gave the basar of the bachar to the kohen. Ma'aser behema is a carbon, but it can be eaten by its owner. You don't find anywhere in the Torah that ma'aser behema needs to be brought to the kohen. It's merely a carbon shlom. They can all be eaten b'chol ha'ir, in all of Yerushalayim, b'chol ma'achel, with any type of preparation, l'shnei yamim v'layla echad, like a shlomim for 2 days and 1 night. About it. Zok to Gemara, Rashi has a very interesting point over here. We just learned that the Bechor can be eaten, the Bechor and Meiser can both be eaten like a Korban Shlomim for 2 days and 1 night. Look at what Rashi comments on this. This is on the 4th intermediate line of Rashi. The Gemara is going to bring a Bechor. How you know a Bechor you can eat for 2 days and 1 night. Meiser lo yadam eicha. Zok Rashi Meiser, I have no idea what the Bechor of Meiser is. If Rashi doesn't know, I'm not going to look for it. So Rashi, I have no idea what the makar is. How we know that meiser get to be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Okay, gewaltig. But the Pesach ein nechal ela b'layla can only be eaten by night. We know that. Ve'ein nechal ela chatzois, and with your abonon they limited to chatzois kidei laharchik etzod minan avera. Ve'ein nechal ela lemnuyav. Only people who can eat are people who chipped into the carbon, who are listed financially on the sponsors of the carbon. As Rashi says, lemnuyav. They were included in the calculation when the animal was purchased. And it's only allowed to be prepared, roasted. No other way is allowed to prepare this meat. Who is the Tana, Zok Rashi, who says that Meiser uPesach bizrika? How do we know that they have a din zrika? How do we know bichlal that there's a din, a mitzvah to do zrika of meiser and to do zrika of the Korban Pesach? Maybe there's no din zrika at all. Obviously, since the Tana is saying that they're similar, Bechor and Meiser, the Pesach and Meiser are similar to Bechor, that they need a zrika, where do we know it from? The Katani Shinabachilosam, Mechlal de Matan Domim Loishta. They have the same Matan Domim, Pesach and Meiser share the same Matan Domim as Bechor. So Obe Bechor, so by Bechor is the pasuk. It says as Domam Tizraik. So Zok to Gemara. This is a Chazara of a Gemara we had a couple of lot ago. Man Tanu Amar Chista Rabbi Yosy Aglili. The Tana is Rabbi Yosy Aglili. The Tanya Rabbi Yosy Aglili Omer Chel Boy Lo Nemar. So let's look at the pasuk that describes what's done with the Bechor. It says as follows. Es bechor shor oy bechor kesef oy bechor eis loy sifte koydeshem. Es damom tizroik ala mizbeach. Their blood, plural. What means es damai? The dam of a bechor. What do you mean damam loshen plural? Es damai. We're talking about one carbon, the carbon of a bechor. So it should say es damai tizroik ala mizbeach. Why does it say es damam? It says ves chelbom taktir. Their chelev, its chelev. We're talking about the carbon of a bechor. Why is it loshen rabbit? Zok Rabbi Yosy Aglili. I'm going to tell you why. The Tanya Rabbi Yosy Aglili Eimer Chelboy le'nemar loshen yachid ela chelbam damoy le'nemar ela damam. Limit not only on Bechor but on Bechor Pesach u'Meiser. The Roiv is also the plural languages to include Pesach and Meiser sheteunin matan damim ve'imurin lekapim mizbeach. Damam, not only the dam of the Bechor but also the dam of the Pesach and the Meiser, not only the chelev of the Bechor, but also the chelev of the Pesach and the Meiser. Now, if you remember, when we had this sugya, there was another Madamar who learned as Chalbam and as Tamam was referring to Shor, Kesef, or Eis. That's why it's a Losher Rabbin. And from here, you can't learn. You can't be Marba, a Pesach and Meiser. Rashi tells us, Rashi reminds us, because he wants us to remember the Gemara that we learned, by Rabbi Shmuel, we learned that Pesach is b'shvicha. Remember we learned there's a difference between zrika and shvicha. Zrika is you stand from a distance and you throw the blood from the keli onto the mizbeach. Shvicha is you just pour it down from point blank range. So Rabbi Shmuel doesn't dash from the pasuk this way. He doesn't know anything about a din zrika by a Korban Pesach. So how does he know the matan is down by a Korban Pesach? He learns it in Nafkalei Matan Dam Pesach mi v'dam zivachecha yishafech, and he learns that there's a shvichas down. So we had actually this machlokes a couple of blot ago, whether by the Korban Pesach you make zrikas adam, or whether by the Korban Pesach you make shvichas adam. And if you remember, we had a discussion of shvichas b'chal zrika. Remember the Gemara said that shvicha is zrika is b'chal shvicha, but shvicha is b'chal zrika. We had a whole discussion about it. But that Gemara is what our Gemara is referring to. How do you know that the Zrikas Adam of the Bechor Meiser Pesach has to be only on the Mizbeach where there's a Yosy there? Amar Belazar, very simple. Asya Zrika me'oila. It says Zrika by the Bachar. It says by the Oila v'shachar has been abakar lefnei Hashem v'kriva ben Aaron akaydim esdama v'zarku. So it says Zrika by the Oila and it says Zrika by Bachar. And we dash it going on to Nun Zayin Amar Aleph. The Oila Gufa Minala, and how do you know Oila requires a Zrika? T'chsev El Yisoid Mizbach HaOila. By Oila it says that where does the dam need to be spritzed? It needs to be spritzed on a place where there is a Yisoid. We had a long discussion about this. It said several times, right? That we learned that it has to be placed where there's a yisoid. The Mizbeach HaPanimi doesn't have a yisoid. We learned. Remember, there's a second limit, and the third limit is every carbon that you are makar on the Mizbeach needs rikas dam. So limit al oila schreiva, and the word chayv is taken out. Limit al oila teaches that every carbon oila shatuna yisoid. The dam needs to be spritzed on the place where there is a yisoid. So, for the Gemara, if that's what you know from oila, why limit it to just that halacha that the dam needs to be spritzed where there's a yisoid? There are so many other halachas that can be imported from oila to the bechar. We said bechar needs one matana. Maybe if you're learning it from oila, you need shtei matana shenarba. Amar Abaye, lamali lemichtav saviv ba'oila saviv bechatas. It says by the oila you spritz it on the mizbeach saviv. By chatas it says you spritz it on the mizbeach saviv. Why couldn't you learn one from the other? The teretz is havu shnei ksuv mabam keechad v'chol shnei ksuv mabam keechad ein melam. Now here, this is a very big chiddush that we're learning over here. Why are we learning a very big chiddush? Because we know there's this concept of shnei ksuv mabam keechad. Where do we normally apply the concept of shnei ksuv mabam keechad? By a binyanav. If you have one halacha that her tells us, and we export it to another area through a binyanav, the Gemara says, why are you only exporting it to A? Why don't you export through the same binyanav to B and to C and to D and to E? So the Gemara says, you know why? Because the Torah didn't only say it in one place. The Torah mentioned this halacha in two places. Why would the Torah have mentioned it in two places? It must be to tell you that the halacha should only apply in those two places, not anywhere else. That's when there's a binyanav. The problem is over here we're not starting off with a binyanav. Over here we're starting with a gzeira shava from oila to bechar. So binyanav we know neutralizes a binyanav, but here the Gemara is saying that the shnei ksuv abam keechad is even going to neutralize a limit that we learned with the gzeira shava, right? Because the Gemara is asking, you have a gzeira shava from bechar to oila. It says v'zarku. So the same way oila has this halach of savim, so too the bechar should have a halach of savim. So the Gemara answered that shnei ksuv abam keechad. So you see the fact that shnei ksuv abam keechad is ein malamdan even from a gzeira shava. That's where Rashi speaks out. Rashi asks, we're not trying to learn through a binyanav, which is where we know you use the concept of shnei ksuv abam keechad. Abai tells us a massive chiddush. Ashmin Abai, the shnei ksuv abam keechad ein malamdan, afilu b'gzeira shava, oiseh davar shenichtav b'shnei. Even if you have a gzeira shava, it still will be neutralized with a taina of shnei ksuv abam keechad. It says something by Asham as well. Everybody agrees that shloisha ksuv b'bam keechad u'shloisha vadai ein melamdin. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we're to finish daf Nun Vav, and tomorrow, Baruch Hashem, we'll learn Nun Zayin. Tomorrow is a big school for Parnasa to learn, because Nun Zayin is the oasis of Zon. A Zon is a koil. So we should have a big school from the daf tomorrow.